Okay, so this is a lecture on Chapter 5, Integumentary System, and this mini lecture will cover 5.1 and 5.2. So let's start with what is the integumentary system? Well, anything that's our skin, hair, nails, sweat glands, and sebaceous glands would all be grouped together as part of the integumentary system. We are not covering in lab or lecture hair or nails, so this is section 5.5 and 5.6. You are not responsible for in lecture. Now, while I say you're not responsible for knowing the details of the hair and nails, you should be aware that they are both components and belong to the integumentary system. Okay, so let's first start with skin. You probably already remember from lab that we have two primary layers of our skin, and that would be our epidermis and our dermis. We also have deep to the dermis our hypodermis. This is not considered a true layer of our skin. It's also called the superficial fascia or the subcutaneous layer. Because it's not considered a true layer of the skin, this is all we're going to talk about as far as the hypodermis today, and then we're really just going to focus on the epidermis and the dermis. So what is the hypodermis? Well, it's the layer that lays deep to the dermis. It's predominantly adipose tissue. So if you remember from the skin models from lab, you probably saw all the little yellow circles um, embedded within this layer, and those are just representing adipose tissue. And if we know the function of what adipose tissue or fat is in our body, this typically to act as a shock absorber as well as for insulation. It also helps to anchor underlying structures, and that's predominantly going to be our muscles. Now back to our epidermis and dermis. Epidermis is the general layer of our skin. It also has 5 specific layers, which I think you had to identify in lab, but we'll talk about again in more detail today. And again, the most superficial region. It's consisting primarily of epithelial tissue. So if you remember from chapter 4 when we talked about the different tissue types, all epithelial tissue is avascular, meaning it doesn't have any sort of blood supply. So there aren't any arteries and there aren't any veins. So how does it get what it needs in order to undergo mitosis and things like that? Everything that it needs it's going to get from the underlying layer, which is your dermal layer. And this is going to contain all the vasculature and the nutrients needed to supply the epidermis. And the dermis is predominantly fibrous connective tissue. So here's a good illustration, and it kind of looks like the skin model that you saw in lab. But we can see our epidermis out here. So again, our most superficial layer. It's broken down up into 5 specific layers, which we'll talk about. And then our dermal layer, just deep to that, which is broken up into 2 layers as well, our papillary layer and our reticular layer. The papillary layer is called the papillary layer because it contains these little projections right here called dermal papillae. Once we get beneath those dermal papillae, we've entered the reticular layer. So the reticular layer is the bulk of the dermis itself, and it's going to house different things such as eccrine glands, erector pili muscles, sebaceous glands, and our hair root and follicle. We also can see here that it's going to house different structures such as our lamellar or Pacinian corpuscles. I do not see the Merkel or tactile corpuscles. They would normally reside right here in the dermal papillae. And we'll talk more about all of that. So for lab, you had to identify where these structures were located, and then for lecture, you need to know the functions of each one of these. So let's focus now on the epidermis, so the most superficial general layer of the skin. We can find 4 different cell types here, but before we get to that, we talked about how the epidermis is predominantly stratified squamous tissue, more specifically keratinized stratified squamous. And it's keratinized stratified squamous because one of the cell types found within the epithelia are keratinocytes. We can also find melanocytes, dendritic or Langerhans cells, or tactile and Merkel cells. So you need to be aware of what cells can be found in this layer as well as their functions. So the first cell, keratinocytes, its function is pretty much in its name. And keratinocytes are responsible for producing keratin. And this pigment or protein, it gives a protective function to our skin because it's really, really hard protein. The majority of the cells in the epidermis are keratinocytes. So here's an example right here, and we can see them scattered all the way throughout. These are still keratinocytes, they're just dead, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. They are connected. We do want all of our cells to be connected, especially if we're trying to form some sort of barrier. So they're connected primarily by desmosomes, which help with resist tension and things like that. But there are also tight junctions. So we do have a water type barrier within some of these keratinocytes as well. And again, we'll talk about how we lose millions probably every month. A bunch of these will just slough off as they die. The second type of cell that you can find in the epidermis are melanocytes, and this one is also in its name. So the purpose of melanocytes is to produce melanin, and this pigment is responsible for helping protect us against UV damage. So they do produce melanin, and when they produce melanin, they package them into these vesicles called melanosomes. And then as soon as they produce the melanin and put it into melanosomes, they basically pump out all of these melanosomes into keratinocytes so that they have the protection against UV damage as well. So they're basically just the factory to produce melanin and package them, and then they're going to pump it into keratinocytes. And actually, keratinocytes are going to contain more melanin than melanocytes. And again, because they're just trying to produce it so that they can get it to the keratinocytes, because they're the ones that are going to need it for protection. The third type of cell that you have for the epidermal layer are dendritic or Langerhans cells. So again, we're talking about the integumentary system and the skin specifically as a protective function. So we know that our skin is always apt to abrasions or damage. So we have to have some sort of cell there that's able to help fight against microbes if they're able to enter. And that would be our dendritic or Langerhans cells. So these are macrophages. And if you remember the function of these, they're phagocytic cells that can engulf foreign debris, such as viruses, bacteria, and different things like that. So we do have dendritic cells floating around. Here's a picture right here. It's this purple star-shaped cell right there. It has lots of appendages that come off to get to surrounding areas. And when it engulfs or degrades some sort of microbe, it's also going to activate our immune system, which is what we want it to do. The fourth type of cell that you could find in the epidermis that you need to be responsible for are the tactile and Merkel cells. If you remember what a tactile or Merkel corpuscle does, they're both involved in sense. So these are sensory receptors for touch. Specifically, we also have sensory receptors for vibrations or various different things. But tactile and Merkel cells are specifically for touch. And here's a picture of one down here. They lie very deep in the epidermis, really close to the dermal layer down here. So all of these cells are dendritic, are melanocytes, and our tactile cells. They're in the deepest layers, and you'll see why in a little bit. So now that we talked about the 4 different cells that we can find in the epidermis, let's talk about the different layers. There's 5 layers, which you did have to know for lab. But these 5 layers are only found in completeness, so all 5, if we're talking about areas of thick skin. So the hands, the palms of our hands or the soles of our feet would be considered areas where thick skin is present, meaning that we do have a specific layer called the stratum lucidum. Everywhere else in our body that's not the palms of our hand or the soles of our feet, they only have 4 layers right here. and we'll talk about what each one of these layers are. So the deepest layer in the epidermis is your basal layer. So right down here, it's a single layer of cells. This is your basal layer. It's going to lie closest to the dermis for a good reason, is because this layer is the layer that's mitotically active, meaning it's going to divide. So if we have some cells that are mitotically active, we're definitely going to need to be closest to the region where we can get nutrients. So remember, the dermal layer is the only layer that has the vasculature for blood supply and nutrients. So the layer closest to the dermis is going to be the one that's going to be mitotically active. The further away we get from the dermis and the nutrient supply, the less likely we're going to be able to keep those cells alive. So we'll talk about in a little bit how everything beyond a certain layer, which is stratum granulosum, is dead because they're too far away to receive anything to sustain the cellular functions. So this layer, again, it's a single row. It's the only layer that's mitotically active because it contains stem cells. And what happens is that as these cells undergo mitosis to produce two daughter cells, one of the cells is going to stay in the basal layer and one of them is going to get pushed outward. And as these continue to divide, they continue to push the cells closer to the superficial face of the epidermis, and eventually, again, they'll die off. The bulk of this layer are going to be the melanocytes. So the melanocytes are going to be there to produce and pump out melanin into those melanosomes so that we can push them into the keratinocytes as they're formed. The next layer, if we're going more superficially, is stratum spinosum. It's several layers thick compared to a single layer thick. So all the way right here would be our stratum spinosum. It contains web-like system of intermediate prekeratin filaments. They are attached by desmosomes, which we talked about, and those allow for resisting tension and pulling forces. This layer appears spiky, so it's also called the prickly layer. If we look, well, you can't really see it right now. Let me see if there's a... Here, they look prickly, like they have little spines. That's not really how they look, only under a microscope. So when they're fixed and prepared for slides, they shrink a little bit. And when they shrink, you can see the different junctions, giving them that prickly appearance. Okay, so they're called prickle cells, like we talked about. We also have a ton of keratinocytes and melanosomes and dendritic cells in this layer right there. The third layer is, if we're going again more superficial, is the stratum granulosum, or the granular layer. It's about 4 to 6 layers or cells thick. Most of them are flattened and thin. We can see some differences in this layer. This is the layer that I told you to identify and stratify squamous so that you can tell whether or not it's keratinized or not keratinized. If it's keratinized, you can see this granular layer really well. So this is the layer where we actually have the process of keratinization begin, where these cells start to accumulate keratohyalin granules. So that's one type of granule that they accumulate. The second type that they accumulate during keratinization are lamellar granules. So keratohyalin, that's going to help the keratin fibers form in the upper layers, and then the lamellar granulars, these are going to contain glycolipids. If you know that lipids repel water, then you know that glycolipids are going to be water resistant, and they help slow the loss of water from our body. Anything above this layer is dead. And again, we already talked about this a little bit, but because they're too far away from the blood supply that is coming from the dermis. So stratum, or the basal layer, the spinosum layer, and the granulosum layer, all three of those layers are close enough to the dermis so that they can maintain their functions. Once we pass the granulosum layer, and we're only showing stratum corneum here, but also included would be stratum lucidum. The stratum lucidum and the stratum corneum layer are too far away from the blood supply and the source of nutrients to sustain them living. So everything above stratum granulosum is dead. So stratum lucidum, it's only again found in thick skin, so in areas of our palms and the soles of our feet. And it's a really, really thin layer and it's absent in this photo, but it would be translucent and you could barely, barely, barely see it. Typically only 2 or 3 rows, and again, because it's above stratum granulosum, it would be dead. And it's going to lie superficial or just deep, superficial to stratum granulosum. The most superficial layer and the thickest layer that we have in our epidermis is the stratum corneum. It's about 20 to 30 rows of flat, anucleated. So as the cells die, they lose their nucleus, but we still retain the keratin. So we have keratinized dead cells. It's about 75% of the entire thickness of our epidermis. And even though they're dead, they provide a huge amount of function for us, including protection because they retain the keratin. They have the glycolipids from the granules from the stratum granulosum, so they help prevent water loss. And they also protect against abrasion and penetration. And they can act as a biological chemical barrier as well. So those are the 5 layers. Kind of have an understanding of their general functions, which ones are present in both thick skin and thin skin, and the 4 different types of cells that you can find, and in which layer of the epidermis are these cells predominantly found. And that's it for 5.1 and 5.2.